All right, let's open our Bibles back up to Genesis chapter 3. Last week we began our series on Genesis 1 through 11 by looking at God's unique and sovereign position as the creator of the entire cosmos. He is the one who stands independent from it, but is intimately involved in it. He is the one who brings order out of chaos, bringing form to what was formless, and abundant filling to what is empty. And certainly, as we look around at the world today, the creation that we can still see here today, we cannot deny the fingerprints of our sovereign Creator God. Amen? We can see the order that He has brought to this creation and His creative power. But at the same time, we have to admit that the world we live in today doesn't exactly match up to the world described in Genesis 1 and 2, does it? Whereas the creation of Genesis 1 and 2, the creation that we see there is described as very good. It's shown to be a place of God's loving rule through mankind made in His image, where the earth sprouts vegetation abundantly, and all the animals and the people are provided for in a perfect relationship with God and with each other. Today, we find death, decay, war, destruction, disease, famine, hatred of God and hatred of each other, selfishness, anger, and a whole host of other terrible things. Isn't that true? What happened? That's what we're here to talk about this morning. All of these things, the things that we see that are wrong with our world and with ourselves, as we see our own propensity for wickedness, all of it had its start here in Genesis chapter 3, and it can be summed up in one three-letter word: sin. I tried to make it as big as I could for effect. Sin is a big problem, isn't it? Not just actions of sin, but the effects of sin. We're going to talk about that a little bit more next week. Today, I want us to focus on the first half, the first part of the issue here. You see, because the perfection described in the beginning of Genesis didn't last very long, and it was because the people of God, the people made in God's image, decided that serving as His representatives on the earth wasn't good enough. They wanted to become gods themselves. And so we're going to spend our time today looking at the steps in the process that they had to take to reach this conclusion. To get to the point of rebellion, what are the steps that the first man and woman had to take? Next week we'll unpack some of the fundamental consequences of their action. But I want us to first look here at this road to rebellion, we're calling it. And it began with a conversation. Look here at verses 1 through 5 of Genesis chapter 3. It all begins when the serpent, who is more crafty than any beast of the field that the Lord God has made, says to the woman, "Did God really say? Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" So the first thing that has to happen here is that this crafty serpent questions God's instructions. Did God really say? And look at the way in which he questions them. "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden?" God's actual instructions to Adam are found in the previous chapter, chapter 2, verse 16. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." The serpent comes along and questions, did God actually actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? He's kind of twisting up what God had said and presenting it as this question of doubt, of are you sure you really know what's going on here? Now, the first question that comes to most of our minds when we read this passage about this serpent coming and saying to the woman, did God actually say, is, who is this serpent? What's going on here? There's no mention of this serpent earlier. It just sort of pops onto the scene. And of course, there's lots of different perspectives from different scholars and things. I like the way that Martin Luther talked about it. He talked about it being a normal reptile that Satan was speaking through. Maybe. The term crafty there is a term that it just means like careful in that sense. It's very, very smart and careful. It's also used in the Proverbs to talk about the prudent person. So it's a word that can be used in a positive sense or a negative sense. It can be somebody that's prudent, that's careful about the way that they live, to live in a godly way, or it can be someone that's careful in their deception. And we certainly see that here. We're going to see it more clearly as we go along. So whether this was a normal reptile that Satan was speaking through, as Luther said, or maybe it was some incarnation of Satan himself, that, as we find in 2 Corinthians 11:14, he's known to disguise himself. He can disguise himself as an angel of light, 2 Corinthians 11 tells us. He's also referred to as the serpent of old in Revelation 20. Either way, whatever is happening here, what is obvious is that this serpent is speaking Satan's deceptive counsel into Eve's mind, into the mind of the woman here. Did God actually say? Our enemy, the devil, still asks that question today. We can recognize his voice here. Did God really say? See, his question here is all about casting doubt on Eve's perception of God. He's trying to get Eve to question what she thought was true about God. And the way that he misquotes God's instructions here, did God actually say that you may not eat from any tree in the garden? The way he misquotes God's instructions is also meant to downplay or deny the generosity of God. Because rather than saying, you may surely eat of all the trees in the garden, Satan says, did God say you can't eat from any trees? Is God holding out on you? Is God holding back the best from you? Where are we tempted to listen to questions like this? When God gives instruction in his word, but then there's that nagging voice in the back of your head that says, did God really say that? Is God really looking out for me with these instructions? Does your radar, does your internal, whatever, radar light up when you hear a voice that whispers that question, that seemingly innocent question, did God really say that? Well, Eve must have had something light up because she tries correcting the serpent. Look at verses 2 and 3. She tries correcting him. She says, well, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. So Eve does a couple of things here in trying to, seemingly trying to correct the serpent. First of all, she downplays God's bounty just like Satan did. She says, well, yeah, God, we can eat from the trees in the garden. God said, you may surely eat from all the trees in the garden. And he says, yeah, well, we can eat from the trees in the garden. So she, first of all, is starting to perhaps waffle a little bit in her understanding of how bountiful and generous God is in what he's done. But then the second thing she does is adds to his instructions, doesn't she? Look again at chapter 2, verse 16. You may surely eat of every tree in the garden. There's the bounty. But verse 17, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. She says, you shall not eat or touch it. You see, Eve is being extra safe. Right? If I'm not touching it, then I'm not going to eat it. Right? This is good. Put an extra layer of protection around the commands of God. What actually happens? When you add to God's restrictions, what happens? You develop a relationship that's all about keeping the rules, or how can I be good enough? We get ourselves into trouble when we try to add to God's demands. You may think you're adding an extra layer of protection. You're actually focusing on the wrong thing. What if the key to resisting temptation is actually getting our attention, our focus on the God whom we are following, this Lord and Savior whom we are following, instead of spending all my time focusing on how I can try harder to not do this? What if we've got it flipped around? What if we've got the wrong way around, and actually you are kept from going against God's commands by your attentiveness to your relationship to Him, by your focus on His character? It's like, when I was growing up, I was mowing lawns for this each summer. And when I was mowing lawns, the way that you do it is you go around the perimeter of the property first, and then you start making your lines, going back and forth. All right? And when I make a line in the grass, whether I'm push mowing or using a riding mower or something, I'm looking ahead at the goal of where I'm supposed to be. Right? I'm looking down the line of where do I want this line to go. You can't mow the lawn by walking backwards and looking back to where you were. The lines would be like this, right? You'd be constantly zigzagging all over the place. I think of that a little bit in the way that I think about following God's commands. We follow Him. We don't walk backwards, always trying to, I gotta avoid this, and I gotta avoid this, and I gotta avoid this. It's I want to be like Christ. I want to know and love Him and walk with Him, and I'm pursuing Him. No need to add to His commands and His restrictions. So where's your focus this morning? Avoiding bad stuff? Or following Him? Satan has Eve right where he wants her at this point. He has introduced the doubt to her mind, and her response has shown that she's not really on firm footing here in terms of her understanding and her application of God's instructions. And so it leaves the door wide open for the third thing to happen here. The serpent accuses God outright. You see, Eve's sort of halfway correction of the serpent has left her wide open to hear a direct assault on God's character. Satan doesn't begin with saying, God's a liar. He begins with the question, did God really say? Can you really trust Him? And then, as you get further down the road in harboring these thoughts and continuing this conversation, now he's open to say, you will not surely die. God's lying to you. Why? Why would God lie? Well, because He's trying to keep all the good stuff for Himself. He knows, he says there, when you eat of it, verse 5, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So he first of all accuses God of lying, like God has these ulterior motives. He's not actually looking out for you. And then he presents this sort of half-truth. Your eyes are going to be opened. You'll know good and evil. And actually, that's partly true. That's exactly what happens to Adam and Eve a couple verses later. Spoiler alert. They do have their eyes opened, but not the way that they were expecting. They don't become gods themselves. Actually, what it does is introduces shame. For the first time in all of creation, they can't look at each other. They want to cover themselves up. They are ashamed because of what has happened. Their eyes are opened, but not in the way that was promised. And isn't this usually the way it goes? We harbor doubts. First of all, we harbor doubts about God's goodness, and then we're not shocked when our enemy denies him outright. We leave ourselves open to the enemy's lies when we toy around with these thoughts of, well, maybe God didn't really mean that, or maybe God's not actually as bountiful and good and loving as I thought. What half-truths are we tempted to believe? If I can only take in this substance, my sorrow will go away. My stresses will be lessened. Half true. Maybe true for a brief period of time. And then you wake up the next day feeling worse than ever. If I can only make this joke about this other person to get everyone laughing, it'll make me feel better about myself. Putting someone else down so that I look better. Well, half true. You may feel better for a moment. Does it sustain you? Do you become the kind of person that God is pleased with? What are the half-truths that we are tempted to believe? Are we leaving ourselves open to these assaults from our enemy because of the way that we ignore God's goodness, the way that we focus in on the wrong things? As we see in this passage, the road to rebellion against God begins with the introduction of doubt. Is God really who he says he is? Can I really trust him? Does he really have my best interests in mind? Or is he holding out on me? But at this point in the narrative, Eve still hasn't actually rebelled in her actions, right? She hasn't actively rebelled against God. There's a step that still needs to be taken here. And we see not only the woman, but also the man take that step in the following verses. Let's look at the actions that we see in verses 6 to 7. In verse 6 it says, "So, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate." The first thing that she does here, she reconsiders the tree. You get the idea that this conversation that she had with the serpent has got her thinking. And now she's thinking about it on her own. You don't hear anything more about the serpent here in verses 6 and 7. This isn't a continuation of the conversation. Now the conversation has moved inward in her own head. Well, let me take another look at this tree. Perhaps I haven't considered it carefully enough. And she's looking and says, you know what? It is good. This tree is good. That word ought to strike a chord in our memory. Who did we just hear about last week that kept looking at things and saying, that's good, that's good, that's good? That was God. All throughout chapter 1, God is looking at these things that he has made and defining them as good. And now here we have Eve taking another look at the tree and deciding for herself what is good instead of trusting what God said about what is good and what is not good. You see, it's almost like the wheels are already beginning to turn. Like, what if I can be God? What if I can take his place? I can define what is good for me. Have you ever heard that before? Oh, I'm so glad that's true for you. That's your truth. You believe what you want to believe, and I'll believe what I want to believe, and I'm so glad that's good for you, that's true. No. We don't get to define what's right and what's wrong. God defines it. So Eve looks at the tree and she sees that it's good. She sees that it's beautiful, right? She says it's a delight to the eyes, which is oddly enough something else that another descriptor that was talked about in chapter 2 when God said he created all these plants in verse 9. Out of the ground the Lord made it to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So she says, it's pleasing to the eyes, it's beautiful. Temptation is very, very rarely, in fact, I would venture to say it's never unattractive, right? That's what makes it temptation. Pleasing to the eyes. It's easily justifiable. It's like the other trees, pleasing to the eyes. And then the last one was the real kicker. It was good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and the tree was desired to make one wise. And that's really the crux of the matter, isn't it? This is the sticking point on which Satan based his temptation, that if you eat of this, it will make you wise. This is the only thing that's holding you back from becoming like God himself. That word desirable, when it says it was desired to make one wise, that desirable word is coming from the same root word for the word coveting that we find in the Ten Commandments, where it says, you shall not covet, you shall not desire these things. Eve coveted God's wisdom for herself. And so, she takes a step to eat the fruit. When she saw all this, she took its fruit and ate. Notice the restrictions that Eve had put on herself. She said, we can't touch it or eat of it, or else we'll die. And now here it says, she took and she ate. She's not even abiding by her own added restrictions. And you can almost picture the scene. It's like, well, I don't know, this serpent is pretty convincing. He says I'm not going to die. And actually, I'll get something better. It's not only that there won't be a bad consequence, there will be a good consequence if I do this. And so, she takes. I touched it, and nothing happened. Oh, phew. I'll bet you that serpent's right. God really is holding out on me. And so then she eats. And then it says, and she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. What? Adam was there the whole time? This is the first time we find him mentioned here in this whole narrative, right? Actually, if we had been reading this chapter in its original Hebrew language, we would have picked up on the fact that Adam was there with her earlier. Because every time that the serpent, in his conversation with Eve, every time he says, you, God knows that you will become like him, it's plural. We don't get that, we don't always see that plural in the English. So Satan is actually saying all the way through here, did God really say, you all shall not eat of any tree in the garden? you guys will not surely die. For God knows that when y'all eat of this fruit, your eyes will be opened. So Adam, we get the idea that Adam is there the whole time. And it's very interesting, because who was the one to whom God gave the instructions to begin with? It was Adam. If you look back at those instructions in chapter 2, verse 16, if you go up a verse, it says in verse 15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree in the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. God gave these instructions to Adam, and whether Adam just didn't pass them along very well to Eve, or whether Eve wasn't receptive to all the details of the instructions, is not completely clear. But the thing that is clear here is that Adam should know better. Adam is there with her, and he doesn't say a word. He lets her go on and have this conversation, doubting God's goodness. What does that say about Adam? What does that say about the stories that Adam was telling himself in his own head this whole time? Eve was deceived, the Bible says. Later on in the New Testament, it talks about how the woman was deceived, but man himself, his action was outright rebellion against God. Adam was the one who received the directions straight from God. Adam was the one who named and therefore exercised authority over all the animals. The serpent's not in charge here. Adam's supposed to be in charge. But he sat back. He stayed silent. And the authority structure is all reversed. The animal speaks to the woman, who speaks to or gives the fruit to the man, who answers to God. And this is why, as we're going to see next week, when God comes and approaches them with what they've done, he doesn't talk to the serpent first. He goes down the ladder of authority. He talks to the man first. What happened? What'd you do? What's the result here? What's the result here? Their eyes were opened. They become wise. The half-truth that they were given plays out. Their eyes were opened, like the serpent promised. But they knew that they were naked. They were ashamed of who they were, of the way that God had made them. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. They tried to cover themselves. And this is what sin does. It brings shame, and it brings a sense of, I need to protect myself. I need to cover myself up. I need people to not see me for who I am. Because if you saw me for who I really am, you would never want to be around me. So I need to curate my image. I need you to see me in a particular way. I need to cover myself from you. I can't be completely honest with you. I can't be completely open with you. With the introduction of sin into the picture, their eyes are opened. They don't become like God himself. The image of God in them is distorted. It is marred, and now they're not able to live in the freedom that God created them to live in. There's something there between them. All because they gave in to this lie that said, you can be your own God. You know that glory that God has, that ought to be yours. You deserve it. You should take that for yourself. In what ways are we tempted to claim God's glory for ourselves. You may ask yourself the question, what area of life am I tempted do I tend to define what is good for myself instead of seeking God's standard, instead of seeking His wisdom? We're looking here this morning in these verses about what we might call the devil's playbook. This is the play that he runs over and over and over again in our lives. This is how he operates. He tries to get us questioning God's goodness and His plan, and then he introduces half-truths, which are really lies, in order to entice us to pursue our own version of good, to claim that God-like status that never belonged to us. And we fall for the trap, just like our first parents did. So what do? First of all, we need to recognize that the key to overcoming this is not within me. It's not my own strength or my own smarts, like I'm going to outwit Satan. I'm going to somehow grit my teeth and overcome this sin nature that's within me. No, we need Jesus' righteousness to cover us. We need the power of the Holy Spirit to work within us, to combat our own sinful desires and the temptations of our enemy. We need to place our faith in Jesus Christ, the only one who stood up perfectly to Satan's temptation. You realize that? What's the first thing that the Holy Spirit does in leading Jesus after Jesus is baptized, the beginning of his ministry? The Holy Spirit leads him into the wilderness to relive the story of Adam and Eve. And to be the perfect new Adam, to be the one that Adam couldn't be, to say no, to remind Satan of what is actually true when Satan tries to introduce his half-truths, to stand firm on what God has said instead of trying to redefine good for myself. Jesus' temptation in the desert is so much more than just, I don't know, like Satan had to have at least one shot in before he started his ministry. This is showing us that Jesus accomplishes what we cannot. And we need to put our faith in Him. We need to daily ask for the Holy Spirit to work within us. And it's only as we do those things that we can take these next steps that I want to list here. I want to mention two things. I want to outline two things briefly. But I want to do it in the context of these things that I'm mentioning are not go home and do this in your own power. This is, I want you to be on your knees pleading for God's mercy and His Spirit's work in you to accomplish these things. Because He's the only one that gives us the strength to do this. So the first thing I want to say to us is to keep God's goodness in focus. To keep God's goodness in focus. We need to be actively rejecting voices which introduce doubts about God's goodness. We need to be taking captive each thought and making it obedient to Christ, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10. We need to be mindful of the voice in our head that says, did God really say? Is God really as good as the Bible makes Him out to be? We need to spend time listening to and thinking about the ways that God has provided. Maybe just writing a list of, here's the ways that God has demonstrated His goodness in my life. And I cling to these truths, these things which are true, when I experience that temptation to doubt God's goodness. The second thing that we need to be doing by the Spirit's power is to give Him the glory that He alone deserves. Not to try to take that glory for ourselves. Not to try and set my own standard, but to follow Him. To lean on Him. If we can learn to truly trust God's goodness and to keep Him on the throne instead of ourselves, I think we will find new freedom from temptation. We will see Satan's lies for what they really are. We'll experience that life and peace which comes from a mind set on the Spirit, instead of the death that we experience from a mind set on the flesh, as we're told in Romans 8. If we don't do these things, however, we'll be easy targets for the enemy of our soul, who longs to steal and kill and destroy, as Jesus said. How will we live? How will we live? Let's pray. Father, I ask that you would bring these truths home in our hearts by the power of your Holy Spirit, that you would help us to understand our need for you each and every day, because we are just like Adam and Eve when it comes to Satan's temptation. We are prone to wander. We are prone to question your goodness and your glory. Help us, Lord, to follow you wholeheartedly. Help us to trust you. I pray for any of those here today who have not taken that step of placing their faith and trust in Jesus Christ for salvation. I pray that they would do so today. They would come to know you truly, and your Spirit would work in our hearts. Change us, Lord, from the inside out. That's what we need. We ask it in Jesus' name.